Being a fitness coach is very strange for several reasons, but probably the thing that makes it the strangest is that I'm always trying to optimize the amount of value people get, and then I have to scale that back according to what people are actually willing to do consistently and over a long period of time. So it's definitely really strange when you consider that aspect, that I'm trying to optimize while at the same time the general public isn't necessarily concerned with optimization as much as they are concerned with a feeling of the workout in the moment. Now, the reason somebody would hire a fitness coach is because they're under the impression that they don't have the time, the energy, the resources, the bandwidth to actually come up with an effective training protocol on their own. So they're paying somebody else essentially to do that for them, which I think is a great option, because as a fitness coach, I don't know much about gardening, for example. And so flowers are going to die. And it's easier for me to ask an expert how to do that than it is for me to spend all my time and energy in order to make something like that happen. And that might not be the best analogy, but I think you get the point. So this video, the discussion today, is going to be on the highest amount of leverage that we can have with a specific training modality over a long period of time. When we're talking about leverage, it's better to think about leverage as a big handle that's clamped tight at the bottom. If you were to grab near the bottom of this handle, it's going to be much harder to pull than it would be if you grabbed at the top of this handle. So we're talking about maximum leverage here. Now, when it comes to leverage over time, I always think about myself 5 years from now and what my goals are 5 years from now. I very rarely concern myself with what my goal is for today. Because if I were to get caught up in what I want to feel like today, then that's usually going to sacrifice my goals 5 years from now. And I think the point that illustrates that the best is, if I was looking to feel a certain way because I'm under some preconceived information that I got a long time ago, that if I push myself as hard as I can right now in today's workout, then I'm going to get the best results from that. Now, I know that not to be true, and all experts know that not to be true, that you cannot just drive yourself into the ground every time you train. All that's going to do is burn calories now, but that's not going to have a high leverage effect on you 5 years from now. Now, when we're talking about high leverage, the two things that are going to make the biggest difference in your overall performance and health in the future are the amount of muscle mass you have and your VO2 max. Muscle mass is pretty simple. That's how much muscle you can put on your body. And as people who are natural, there's going to be a limit to that for sure, but we want to push it up to that limit. As we age and go through life, life is better with the more muscle that we have. Not just because we're more capable of doing daily tasks, but because muscle is an active endocrine organ. And it has a lot of really important duties that it does for your body. Number one is reducing blood sugar. Muscles soak up glucose in the system and they use it for contractile force. So we want to build the maximum amount of muscle that we can. Now, VO2 max, your body's ability to utilize oxygen and a consistent long-term heart rate. That is very useful because there's a specific part of your heart that really doesn't get engaged unless you're stressing it over a long period of time doing one specific modality. Meaning, if I want my heart rate to stay at X beats per minute, there's a way for me to do that. And the simplest way to do that is to run. And if you can't run yet because you're too heavy or because you have issues with your joints or whatever it is, biking is a good substitute for that. You can go slower in a low gear uphill to maintain a certain heart rate, and you can go faster in a higher gear downhill to maintain that same heart rate. And the same goes for running. You can slow down on the uphills, you can speed up on the downhills to maintain a very consistent heart rate. So these two are going to have the most amount of leverage over a long period of time in your life. So let's compare those styles of training and what's going to build the most amount of muscle to some other forms of training real quick. High intensity interval training is a favorite of people, and it's a favorite because it makes you feel like you did something. It makes you feel like you could give it your all. You get a big endorphin rush from doing it. Your heart rate's elevated, you're sweating, and the feeling is good. And I like the feeling just as much as anybody else does. But when it comes purely to building muscle over time, high intensity interval training is a very poor way to do that. Because the problem with high intensity interval training is there's not a lot of adaptation required. And what I say by adaptation is that a term you often hear in the fitness community is that you have to keep the body guessing. You can't let it adapt, which couldn't be further from the truth if we're trying to build muscle. The adaptation to the exercise is building muscle. That is the adaptation. So you by all means want to adapt. Now when it comes to high intensity interval training, you do build quite a bit of muscle in the beginning, but that takes a sharp decline at some point and begins to track down, and it does that for a very specific reason. The reason is you cannot adapt to the training. A secondary reason is the risk for injury and aggravation with high intensity interval training is quite high compared to different modalities. So as you get different aggravations and injuries, you start to miss days, or you start to have to scale back, and then you know where that goes. I think everybody who's been training for a little bit of time knows where that goes. When we're talking about increasing the VO2 max and then increasing the muscle mass, improving the muscle mass, high intensity interval training has a big spike. It gets people stronger than what they were at their baseline really fast, but then it starts to decline as your body can't adapt and as you start to build up aggravations and injuries. Whereas hypertrophy training and powerlifting have a shorter increase in strength in the beginning, but it scales over time and it works together to improve your strength and your muscle mass. It also does this while having a relatively low risk for injury or aggravation, and the reason for that is simple. You're very calm when you're doing hypertrophy training and powerlifting. You have to be calm. You don't want to get yourself hyped up, and you don't want to be dependent upon feelings from that training to change your outlook on the day. There's a protocol you have to go through when doing a bench press or a squat or a deadlift where your body has to be set up right. You have to be focused, you have to be concentrated, you have to know what your numbers are going into that, and you have to linearly progress, which is huge because there is no way to linearly progress with high intensity interval training, which is another reason why it has a steep decline in your amount of muscle mass. Is there any way to gauge the amount of push-ups you can do in 20 seconds this week versus 6 weeks from now? Are you counting the amount of push-ups you're able to perform? Are you sure that your core is locked in tight and that your elbows are coming above the back so you're getting full range at the bottom of your push-ups? Or is your heart rate maxed out so you're just trying to get through the training? For the most part, people experience a lack in connectivity with their form when their heart rate is high. And then not to mention, if the push-ups come before dips or shoulder presses, then you're not going to be able to accurately gauge your improvement on push-ups. So you combine all the things I just talked about and you can see how hard it is to linearly progress when it comes to high intensity interval training. Now when it comes to increasing your VO2 max, that is going to require low intensity steady state training or zone 2 training, which increases the actual count of mitochondria in your muscles. Combine that with high intensity steady state training, which is operating at a higher heart rate for a shorter period of time, but without training the modality. So this would be running or biking or anything you can do where you can maintain a very specific heart rate for X amount of time. I use running as a good example of that for a simple reason. You can wear a watch and stay engaged with your heart rate and try to maintain a specific heart rate. You can do low, slow cardio or zone 2 training, low intensity steady state, and increase the mitochondria count while at the same week do high intensity steady state training, which is a higher heart rate for a shorter period of time. And over time, your VO2 max is going to take off because you're going to pair those two together. Versus high intensity interval training, you're going to get more of a VO2 max, more of a cardio boost in the beginning, but that's going to sharply decline for the same reason that it declines when we're talking about muscle mass. And that is the injury or aggravation rate is much higher with high intensity interval training than it is with VO2 max training as far as low intensity steady state. and high intensity steady state cardio. Now, the other thing to focus on when we're talking about leverage is the amount of calories we burn while performing a certain task. Now, when we're talking about burning calories, you have to think about the 42 to 78 hours after the training, because that's where the majority of calories are burned during specific training, and that's called or exercise post-oxygen consumption, depending upon where you're looking this up at. Now, the exercise post-oxygen consumption for high-intensity interval training actually is just a little bit lower than hypertrophy training and a little bit lower than powerlifting. When you're doing hypertrophy and powerlifting, you're burning, on average, for every calorie you burn during the training, you're burning about 4 calories in recovery from the next 48 to 72 hours. And that's important to note, because what people want to focus on is how many calories they burn during the training. Now, if your sole focus is to burn the most amount of calories in each training session while you're training, then you're sacrificing your long-term muscle building over time. So in the future, your optimal self has 5 to 10 pounds more muscle than what you have right now. And that future self is burning more calories, whether they're awake, whether they're asleep, whether they're at work, whether they're going on a hike. You're burning more calories doing the daily activities that you do normally anyway. So you can either choose to maximize the 45 minutes that you're in the gym training and burn the most amount of calories you can and get the sweat in your eyes and be out of breath and feel really good about that. Or you can lower the intensity while you're training, focus more on hypertrophy and powerlifting, have a greater exercise post-oxygen consumption, while minimizing your risk for injury in the long term. Now, I'm not gonna just completely shit on high intensity interval training, and the reason for that is I did it for years and years. But the reason I stopped was very simple. I started to get older. I don't want elbow problems and shoulder problems and low back problems and knee problems, and I started to get all those things doing mostly high intensity interval training. Now, I still do high intensity interval training, but I only ever operate at what I consider to be 70% of my maximum output, or 70% of my maximum heart rate, depending upon what we're doing. Now, that can be confusing for a lot of people, especially people who train with me, because they see me moving pretty fast. But that's only ever 70% of my maximum. And I started doing that years ago because I wanted more mitochondria in my muscles. Mitochondria has an ability to utilize different substrates of fuel source in your system, carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. So when you have more mitochondria, you can do more with a lower intensity. So you can outperform normal people while only moving at 70% of your max. So basically, I just want to summarize this. High intensity interval training is still useful. It's useful for a boost in your endorphins to make you feel better from time to time. But it certainly isn't useful if your primary motive is to improve your muscle mass or to improve your VO2 max, which are the two things that have the most amount of leverage over time when it comes to improving your health and improving your athletic performance. And this is important to go over, because me personally, in my 40s now, I'm going to be 43 in just a few months, I want to minimize the risk for injury and aggravation while maximizing my muscle mass and maximizing my VO2 max. And there's only one real way to do that, and that's to stick with the highest leverage protocols and minimize the lowest leverage protocols. So me personally, I want to power lift, I want to do hypertrophy, and I want to do low intensity steady state training combined with high intensity steady state training. And I want to do all of these things systematically in a way that's going to constantly improve my outcome for performance and longevity. Now, over the last 10 years, I have only ever built muscle while simultaneously running faster. And those two things are things that a few years ago were thought to not be able to coexist. And luckily, over the last couple years, we've had people come to the forefront and label this style of training as hybrid training. Or if you do this type of training for a while, you're considered a hybrid athlete because you have muscle mass, but you also have a high VO2 max. Like I said earlier, there's one way to do that. That's to combine low intensity steady state training with high intensity steady state training at the same time as doing hypertrophy and powerlifting. Now I get it, and I have to come to you guys with compassion when going over all this information, because things change regularly in the world of health and fitness. And I not only don't mind change, if I learn something that's counterproductive to a whole host of information that I've learned in the past, I will change 180 degrees on a dime, and I will stick to a protocol long enough to be able to have actual metrics for improvement. We're talking about metrics for improvement here. Let me go over this. If I'm squatting, I know 8 weeks from now if I'm actually stronger because I'm tracking every time I squat. I'm following a proven protocol. So I have a metric that lets me know if I've improved. If I'm running and I'm doing 5 kilometers as my goal to reduce the amount of time it takes me to run 5 kilometers, I know every time I run all out for 5 kilometers if I've improved from the last time I've ran 5 kilometers. And that's a metric that I can track. I can accurately track these metrics. Am I getting stronger? Am I getting faster? Basically, is my muscle mass improving and is my VO2 max improving? Those are 2 ways to accurately track those things. Now, when it comes to high intensity interval training, again, I'm not trying to just shit all over it. There is no way to track if you're getting stronger. There is no way to track if you're increasing your VO2 max. All you're tracking is how you feel while you're training. And yes, high intensity interval training makes you feel better in an isolated event, but it does nothing for leverage over time because of the increased risk of injury and because the lower adaptation for building muscle mass and the lower adaptation for increasing VO2 max. And the higher amount of exercise post-oxygen consumption that you get with a combination of hypertrophy and powerlifting versus just sticking to high intensity interval training. I hope this was informative. I hope you guys got something out of that. If you have any questions, you can always ask in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.